Let us pray. Oh God, may your word be spoken and may your word be heard for Jesus' sake. Amen. Theodore Litz, in his classic book on human development, The Person, reports that the infant does not distinguish between self and the world. Both are one comprising the self. In time, all things being equal, the person grows into adulthood. The adult carries and responds to the demands and duties of the outside world. The two are separate, but not inseparable, rather mutually influential. That is to say, the self shapes the outside world, and the outside world shapes the inside world of the adult. This shaping or forming happens in people, in societies, and in cultures. Much of what enables persons to take on personalities and societies to take on values, beliefs, and customs, or what we call national character, and cultures to take on collective mood or zeitgeist, are stories. Last week we talked about discerning the presence of God in times of crisis. Israel, the text for the day, without water in the desert. First century Jews, the New Testament reading, persecuted for breaking away from their synagogues to follow Jesus. Or Orchard Park Presbyterian Church over recent months with the departure of 3 senior staff and the disagreement surrounding those departures. We said that the heart or soul, the innate knowledge of right and wrong, the image of God, the capacity to love, is the seat of discernment. Crisis is the lens through which, with open hearts and minds, our souls, we discern God's presence. Sometimes the presence of God is a direct answer to prayer, remission of a terminal illness, a large bequest that enables the church to expand mission. But we also said it is often in hindsight that we see the hand of God at work in people and events, circumstances that called us to trust and live by faith in the moment, but that we later came to understand. As I look back on the crisis of what I was going to do with my life, which I shared last week, I came to see the presence of God at certain moments that I thought stood alone, but discerned in those occasions and relationships a call to parish ministry. Today, in the story of Jesus healing a man born blind, I want to talk about discerning the presence of God through the stories we tell ourselves, like the story of my call to ministry that weaves together what were, I thought, disparate people and events. We tell ourselves stories to order and understand what is happening in the world, especially in times of turmoil or great blessing. This has been the case since humans gathered around campfires and told stories to explain the starry heavens, floods and earthquakes, droughts and times of plenty. Stories that depict events and occasions common to the human experience over generations and capture the mind and heart are remembered and codified in songs, ceremonies, rituals, and legends that often acknowledge a higher order or creative force, bigger and beyond us. The story of the man born blind is a literary jewel with the clarity and richness of a painting by a Dutch master and the complexity and genius of a Russian novel. The writer of the Gospel of John adheres to the old adage, brevity is the soul of wit, wit meaning in Shakespeare's day, wisdom and intelligence. I urge you to find a quiet place this afternoon and read this account, one of the world's best short stories, in its entirety. Let's consider that story. A man is born blind. The disciples ask, is he or his parents, are his parents sinners? In ancient days, when someone suffered blindness or disease, it was believed God was punishing them for some sin they committed. This version of suffering is a story that still has traction. It is virtually a default for understanding pain. Medical diagnoses answer the how of suffering and anatomically the why, but we long for a story that answers the reason and meaning for our suffering. Unexplained pain is too much to bear. Sin is often the first but fraudulent explanation, just as in these uncertain times with wars and new wars, and a nation nearly as divided as the decade before the Civil War, a plague of blame conspiracies, fraudulent stories to explain these fractious times has descended upon us. We all err, sometimes a lot. But Jesus says the man is not blind because he or his parents are sinful. Rather, his blindness is to reveal the grace of God. Jesus applies mud to the man's eyes, tells him to wash, and when he does, he can see for the first time. Confusion descends on the little village where the man lives. Just imagine, people who have known him all his life are not sure he is the man who was blind. The local rabbi, let's call him the minister, and the Pharisees, let's call them the church leaders, get into the act. Because his healing was on a Sunday and neither man nor the alleged healer were in church, the leaders conclude that whoever he thinks he healed this man, if he was in fact the man born blind, whoever the healer thinks he is not worthy of praise, because he should have known that no one performs work on the Sabbath, including healing. By now, things are spiraling out of control. The minister and spiritual VIPs start relentlessly interrogating the man until the blind man who can now see, suggests that perhaps what they really want to know is how to follow this man who healed him. The man born blind continues. For your information, as if I should have to tell you, leaders of the church, were the man who healed me a sinner and not from God, he could do nothing. This is the acolyte instructing the bishop. Stricken with rage, the religious leaders brand the man born blind a sinner and drive him away. The man is alone. Jesus reappears, informs him that indeed he, Jesus, is from God. And the man says, Lord, I believe, and worships him. A wonderful example of living faith forward and understanding it backward, as Soren Kierkegaard coined that phrase many years ago. There are many takeaways from this story. Let me share two. The beginning and end of the story are concerned with the matter of sin. The disciples ask, who sinned, this man or his parents? The religious authorities have an answer, and so does Jesus. The religious authorities are convinced Jesus is a sinner. But here's the great twist and surprise. In the end, it is they, quick in their judgment and rigid in their theological assumptions, who bear the label sinners. The story is about their false certitude, their claims to see while they live in darkness. Second, the frequency of the verb know, 7 times in this story. Who knows and how one knows are the issue. The blind man admits his lack of knowledge, questioning the Pharisees, by the Pharisees. He's agnostic about Jesus, but clings to his experience, the one thing he does know. The parents of the blind man cannot claim what they know. The threat of rejection forces them to silence. The Pharisees are certain in their knowledge, but their certainty prevents discerning where Jesus' authority comes from. Throughout the story, the blind man makes significant steps in his knowledge of Jesus, but not until Jesus discloses himself does the blind man understand and worship. The blind man, though miraculously healed, can get no further than the miracle until the revelation or discernment of God's presence in Jesus occurs. Though Jesus is absent in much of the story, he's the main issue at stake. How the characters respond to him with honesty and increasing knowledge, curiosity and fear, or anger and threats is instructive for us today. Let me segue to my first 2 weeks at Orchard Park Presbyterian Church. Here are some things I'm learning. You have been genuinely welcoming and warm, and as a result, I feel much at home because of your generosity of spirit. It is clear to me that the administrative infrastructure of this church is alive and well. I have attended 2 staff and 6 committee meetings, and at each one there has been full attendance and those out of town participating by Zoom. That is commitment to the immediate, present, and future of this congregation. I've also had a chance to meet with many of you one-on-one, and I look forward to more such meetings. My goal in these first weeks is to listen and learn how this congregation functions, what your priorities are, and how you are processing the recent upheaval and change. It's fair to say there has been and still is pain and suffering with the change of leadership. But there is also hope, sometimes desperate hope, in a new future for this church. What I'm hearing in your reflections is common ground among almost everyone. There are no winners. It takes 2 to tango, and there is uncertainty about the path ahead. But I'm also hearing different nuances and emphases regarding causes and effects, and a variety of focal points on the past, some on the present or on the future. What I am witnessing is the processing of the recent crisis in different and emerging scenarios or narratives becoming stories that seek to sort out what happened and why that led to these significant changes. Time will clarify and coalesce these narratives that discern in the events of 2025 how God was revealed in a new collective self-awareness and in other needed changes that were implemented. That story will bring renewed faith and closure to this rocky chapter. But I'm afraid I'm making it sound a little too easy. While that may be descriptive of the process of one story coalescing with perhaps various footnotes from the real crisis of this church family, it does not describe the longing and searching for understanding, for hope, for healing, for a return to the shelter, safety, and mission and ministry this church has so richly given to so many for so long. Nor is it descriptive of the existential search for the presence of God and the strength to move forward. It is significant that Jesus reappears in today's story just at the moment when the blind man is cast out of the synagogue. Cut off from family and religion, from heritage and home, the blind man is sought out by Jesus and offered the possibility of faith that understands the source of his healing and new life. We talked last week about how John's community of Jewish Christians were beginning to follow a new commandment, and the commandment of love. Consequently, they were rejected and shunned by their own families and friends for following the teachings of Jesus rather than the Torah. Unless I miss my guess, the great challenge today and in the days ahead for you, the members of this congregation, for your staff, and for me, as well as the interim pastor who will follow me, will be to refrain from knowing too much. And if asked what happened and why, to keep a certain agnosticism and humility rather than possessing complete certainty, crystal clear knowledge of what went wrong and why and who was responsible, like the actors in today's story from John. We all make mistakes. But the final meaning of this chapter will be to encounter the grace of God and the path to new ministry. The challenge for this church family is to live your faith forward and trust that understanding will follow. To keep watch for Jesus to appear in some moment of healing, some encounter that reveals a new path for the rebuilding and revisioning of this venerable church. You see, you are still writing the story of Orchard Park Presbyterian Church at this critical juncture in your long history. The events to record and remember about this chapter are not yet over. There is an interim ministry to come. Then the formation of a pastor nominating committee to follow, as well as deep reflection on who you have been, who you are, and who you are being called to be as a church at this start of the second quarter of the 21st century in this community. Writing any kind of story requires discipline. Stephen King talks about blocking out all distractions. He writes in a basement room at a desk facing a blank wall. The American poet Charles Olson, the great poet who taught at the University of Buffalo many years ago, said, "Research is critical for great writing. Know your subject frontward and backward before pen goes to paper." The point is, when you are tempted to see the plot, including all the players in their roles, the meaning, reason, the why and wherefore, suspend certainty. There are important moments ahead. We are in the first chapter of this novel. The monks call such humility and agnosticism the discipline or practice of surrender. Surrendering our need to control, our desire to have the answers, to have a story, the story, our story of the unfolding events and consequences, the what and why this church has been through the desert of church life it's been through. Surrender allows us to avoid the distractions and gain the awareness to watch for Jesus, and someday for this story to be written. It is more important to live our faith than to understand it. The blind man doesn't understand what has happened to him until Jesus appears to him. All he knows is that he was blind and now he sees, which is the foundation for what will become his faith with understanding, as well as the story that explains why he received his sight, why he was rejected, and then discovered God in Jesus, whom he now worships. You might say all of us are blind, like the people in the story, until we are able to articulate from hindsight how God is and has been at work in our lives. We wake up every day and go about the routine of school, work, play, not thinking of Jesus or God or anything other than getting through the next exam, school project, family business, or hurdle at work. And then something happens. Some old obstacle is removed, some wound suddenly healed, some paralyzing fear taken away. And we realize what happened was a gift that led to understanding how God met us in a desperate moment of need and healing. And one day, when someone asks, "Tell me about yourself or your church," you can tell them. your story.